we're going to launch right into it, right? And I think the first thing that all of us sort of wanted to talk about, maybe, or should talk about, is the recent attack, the most recent attack in Kabul at the wedding. So I'm wondering, what folks' reaction to that is in the context of the peace negotiations and everything that's been going on.
So I can kick that off. So with the wedding attack, I think for me personally, I have family that still live in Kabul. So anytime an attack happens in Kabul itself, I'm definitely messaging cousins and messaging aunts and stuff. My mom doing the same to make sure that everyone's okay. And it just so happened that this time around with the wedding attack, it was in a Shia neighborhood of Kabul, and it just so happened that my aunt's cousin's husband passed away in that attack because he was a guest at that wedding. So, these things happen so far away, right? We're living here in the United States, but there's definitely a very strong emotional attachment and emotional tie to these attacks when they happen. My mom's cousin lived close enough to where the attack happened where the windows of all his, the windows in his house, all of them just shattered when the attack happened. So it's like, in a way, like you're far removed, but also at the same time, you're very much connected and very much going through the emotions of such a trauma. So yeah, that's like my firsthand experience with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because when I read about the attack, I was actually at a family wedding in Vancouver, and it was sort of the same time. And we were, similar to weddings we all go to, there was a lot of aspects that were very traditional and nods to our culture and our heritage and our history. And to wake up the next morning and realize that people were going through that very same thing, and then their experience obviously ended in tragedy, was really sickening. And I thought also it was interesting because some of the responses to the attack were fascinating. And Halima, you mentioned that it was in a Shia neighborhood. I think that's a very important point that, frankly, I don't think about enough, right, is why. But I also thought it was interesting that, for example, the Taliban condemned the attack, right? I sort of said that response, I was like, what world am I in, right? Because like a week earlier or 12 days earlier, they had attacked outside of a police station in Kabul, right, and killed, I think, 14 people or something like that. So it was really sickening, and it was sort of, the timing was odd because I was in that wedding space, and then to read about that, it really just, I couldn't imagine what it was like.
Hey, and I hope my audio is working now, but I guess I wanted to ask, Ali, you're in Kabul, and I just wanted to hear from you about sort of what was your reaction and when that attack happened, and what happens to you as someone in Kabul? Like, who do you reach out to? What is that like immediate reaction when it's like close by?
I mean, a lot of times it's kind of, you read about it on the news or you see it on TV, because even though, so the attack, I went to the wedding hall 2 days later. The attack, it took place maybe like 20 minutes from where I live right now. But you can get kind of so caught up in things, and that's what I'm saying is like something can happen, and even though it's in the same city, it's only, a short distance from where you are. A lot of times you just end up finding out about it either by the nature of your job, or, someone texts you, are you okay? That there's something really odd about that. So that's how I found out. I think it was just through the news, that they were saying that there was this attack near Darlamand. And obviously we have to remember that was 2 days before the celebration of the 100th anniversary of when Amanullah took us from being a British protectorate, essentially like independence. And then so 2 days later, I went to, I couldn't go the very next day because I got caught up with like different media outlets and things like that, asking for video reports and like. And then so the next day I had to write another story about it, and I actually went to the wedding hall itself, and it was actually really small. It's actually probably like one of the smallest wedding halls I've ever seen, and it's kind of hidden because it's behind the police station. It's near the Darlaman Palace and near the Parliament. So if you're not going, because it's not on the main road, it's kind of off to the side. And then so I went and I talked to people there. I talked to people who attended the wedding. I talked to security officials. I talked to people who lost people in the wedding. And by all accounts, it seemed like the attacker actually missed his target. He was trying to go straight, keep going forward, and basically so this was Saturday night, and Monday was big independence celebrations. So he was planning to try and hide out and then attack the independence celebrations. Didn't make it, turned back around, saw that there was a wedding, saw that these guys were coming back from the nikah, and kind of just went in there and detonated his bomb because he didn't make his actual target. So that's sort of the level it's at. And the thing is, like, that's really scary because, these weddings, and so like if a wedding in the US is 200, 300 people, in Kabul it's like 1,000 people. And these wedding halls usually only have one entrance and exit. And that was exactly the case in this.
I mean, I know, Ali, that you're a journalist, so obviously the way you're sharing it with us is not like intentionally, emotionally disconnected, but it's interesting as I hear you talk. I kind of feel in a way like I relate to even the style that you're talking about it, because I think, and I don't want to speak for everyone in the diaspora, but I think what was maybe sad to me about this is that we've gotten so used to so much of this violence happening to Afghanistan on the daily that it's almost, I don't want to say it's unsurprising because tragedy is never something that you expect, but it is unsurprising how much, how numb kind of I felt in a way in response to it. It's almost like one of my grandparents was in hospice care for the longest time. And so our family was kind of, it's never easy losing someone, but you're kind of in a space of contentment with the situation because you understand it's a process and you're just waiting for the next thing. It's not like anything comes to you as a surprise anymore. And I think, I mean, even just what you were talking about and how you're sharing it, I kind of felt like, even in my own experience of this attack, I was like, wow, I mean, at least I still felt so numb, like I expect this almost. Like this is not anything else. This is one of many, attacks that happens on like kind of the daily, such that our PTSD is almost normalized. I don't know. That makes sense?
No. I think I guess I came off wrong. I'm also kind of tired. But
yes, no. 6 a.m. there.
No. It was a huge deal because, like I said, like these weddings, it's like 1,000 people that go, right? And they're in these giant, massive, gaudy wedding halls. And it's really like for 90% of people in the city and in the country, it's really the only outlet you have for like fun and for dancing and for getting dressed up. And so the fact that kind of an event was attacked, whether it was intentional or not, or whatever the actual details were, that in itself really, really scared people. And it really upset people because it's like, well, now I can't even go to a wedding and feel safe. And it was, I mean, everybody was talking about it the next day. I was, I don't want to sound like I'm, like bragging or whatever, but I was doing some like video reports for CNN, and we were the whole time, the whole crew, that's all we were talking about is like, I can't believe they made it into a wedding hall. I can't believe they made it into a wedding. And so, no, it was a huge deal. It was a big deal. I'm sorry, I was probably tired. I was just trying to...
No, I know, it's totally, that's fine.
I think Ali John, like you hit on a really good point in the sense that people, in our culture, like weddings are such a big deal. It's such a time of happiness and celebration that we look forward to it. My cousin, who lives in Kabul, recently just got engaged, and his mom and dad, his fiance's parents, they're trying to plan this wedding in Kabul, and then when this attack happened, they were just like, all right, we're cutting these plans. We're not going to do it in Kabul. It's likely, because we have some family in Pakistan, that we're going to end up doing it there. And this, I've never been back to Afghanistan, so this wedding, for me, I was like, this is it. Like, I'm going to go to Kabul. I'm going to, like, enjoy this wedding of my cousin, finally meet everybody. And now it's likely, because everybody's just so shaken up because of this, that it's not even going to be in Afghanistan. So, like, that's, at least for me personally, like, some of the immediate reactions and just a heightened level of just being scared, like, a wedding is not safe. Neither is, like, schooling, all these other places of celebration or education or anything like that. So it's definitely, in many ways, heartbreaking, too.
And we all, I feel like a lot of times when these really big attacks happen, we start to see it on social media, we see it in different places, but do you feel like we only pay attention to Afghanistan when there's like some really like big tragedy? Like for those of us in the diaspora, for those of us kind of like outside of living there, like I feel like, does it feel like sometimes things kind of catch on social media, or like when we're talking about it with our friends and things like that, and then is it sort of ignored the rest of the time? I wonder what you all think about that.
I mean, I feel like we learn about things when we're told about them, right? And when we sort of find out about them. And I think one of the issues in the diaspora, and I'm responsible and sort of guilty of this, is like where we get our news and how we seek out news versus just being receptacles for news in the U.S. right now. Ali does a ton of reporting. There are other folks who are there doing a ton of reporting for non-U.S. outlets. And I think the way they report actually is very different than how the U.S. reports, because what Iman's talking about in this sort of the stoic detachedness, right, the commonality of all this is like reflected in the reporting, right? And so I think as consumers of reporting, we end up kind of taking that on. So Oman, I think to answer your question, I think one of the issues is like we don't find out because we don't go looking for the news in the same way that I think other people do. And then the other point I wanted to make was I think we also, I felt there was like a lot more outrage, for example, around Trump's comments about wiping Afghanistan off the map, which actually really, is not a possibility, right? There was a lot of outrage and social media activity and all this stuff going on, and people were like taking up arms. But when there's actually a massive attack, right, where people are killed in this very violent and grotesque way, I saw so much less of a reaction, right? And so I wonder if that's because people feel more helpless in responding to that, or because of what Iman's talking about in terms of us being like, yep, well, that's what happens, right? So, but we're going to fight the good fight anyway against Trump.
I think, then, sorry to step in here, but I think there's an interesting thing. I kind of like, in my head, I call it like detached attachment that the diaspora has with Afghanistan, where it's like, if you think about it, for the 1.5 and second generation, 1.5 generation means you were born somewhere else and then you came here as a young child and were mostly raised here. So for most of us who did not spend the majority of our adult lives in Afghanistan and are here, our lives are predominantly have been defined by Afghanistan and a state of instability, because it's been post 1979 Afghanistan, from the Russian invasion onwards. So it's almost like we have this conception of Afghanistan that has really been defined by its constant state of instability. And so that's also a defining feature of how we know our country, in contrast to a lot of these almost like, for those who don't know, my dissertation work studied the Afghan-American community, and a lot of the community kind of described what they know about Afghanistan as kind of like a fairy tale-like thing that their parents or the elder generation would share with them, right? So it's almost like you have this fairy tale vision on the one hand, and then you have this other place that you'd only know as defined by these major features of instability, insurrection, constant, basically all this constant fighting and the things that are happening. So it's almost like we have an attachment on an emotional level that we can't explain, but a detachment in a way that we haven't experienced it. A lot of us, we may not have gone back to Afghanistan. We may feel like we don't fully understand it, or we don't feel like we are entitled to lay claims to this place because we're in a more privileged position than a lot of the people that we feel emotionally attached to. So I think that's kind of a lot of the reactions and things that I witnessed around it. I think how I rationalize the reaction that you're talking about of more Afghan Americans being up in arms about Trump than this attack at a wedding was more because I think they felt like finally this is something in my backyard that I can take action to, and I feel like I am allowed to have ownership over versus something that happened to a place that I'm emotionally tied to, but I just don't know what to do and I feel helpless about. I don't know. I don't know what you guys all thought about that and that reaction, but that was just my take on it.
I think part of the problem is that it's actually not you all's problem. A big part of the problem is with the media itself. Like, so I was saying earlier, the next day I was so, like, I had CNN call, I had the CBC in Canada call, I had Deutsche Welle in Germany call, and Al Jazeera all at once, asking for either like video or text reports, which is why it took me an extra day to actually go to the wedding hall site, and that's completely rare. There have been, Yusuf was saying that there was an attack a week earlier, which is true in Kabul as well. No one called that day, you know? It took something this extraordinary for all of these networks to call and want information, to want stories, to want video reports, to, you know, I mean, like on those 2 days, I was on almost every major network in the world, but look at what it took to get there, right? For instance, like when Trump did say that thing about like killing 10 million people in Afghanistan, no one asked, you know, no one called, no one cared, even though like media loves to bash Trump, right? Because like that's the worst thing in the world to them at this point is Trump's existence. You know, or when he rewrote Afghan history and said that we were somehow sending quote unquote terrorists to the Soviet Union, didn't get any calls that, I mean, there were so many different things that happened that no one in the media ever called or cared. So in a way, it's not entirely, you know, if someone like feels guilty or whatever, it's not really, it's fine because of the fact that it's not being covered. People, the media don't care.
And Ali, what was, if I could ask real quick, like, were people talking about the Trump comments about like I could wipe off Afghanistan off the map and like I just don't want to, but I don't want to kill like 10 million people. Like, what were people in Afghanistan saying? And then I want to ask some of the like what you were hearing kind of in the diaspora, because I know Yusuf, you had a viral post around that.
At first, people said there's more than 10 million people here. So we didn't know if he thought the entire population of the country was 10 million people, or he would somehow, you know, like select 10 million people to kill. So there was that, and then there was a lot of anger, a lot of resentment. I still think that in terms of like high level response, I think Hamad Karzai gave a good reaction. I think Rahmatullah Nabil, the former intelligence chief who's running for president, gave a good reaction. Unfortunately, I think our current government didn't do very much. They just asked for clarification and issued like a little statement, but then said like, oh, by the way, they say they're committed to their so-called South Asia strategy. And the one thing we have to remember is that in like the first couple years of Trump, the like well-to-do people of the urban centers of Afghanistan were in love with the guy. You know, they were saying things like, he's bad for his nation, but he's good for ours. I mean, you would find translations of him and Ivanka's books in Dari and Pashto. Like there was a girl who translated one of Ivanka's books into Pashto, I think, and she was like, oh, she's a good role model for women.
Oh.
And there was a lot of people like kind of buzzing about the Trump comment. So I don't know what you all saw and sort of what your reactions were to that.
I guess I'll start. Look, I think the reaction that triggered me was a lot of people sort of adopting this like narrative of like, oh well, you go ahead and try it, and it's the graveyard of empires, and I'd like to see American troops in Afghanistan, and I'm sort of like looking around, being like where have you been the last 20 years, right? I haven't been to Kabul in like a very long time, but from what I remember and what I hear, like you can't get away from the U.S. presence. Now, Lee could probably speak to that firsthand. So I thought the reaction was really interesting and problematic in ways I haven't really figured out yet, because people really up in arms and pounding their chests and sort of acting like they were going to finally, stand up for Afghanistan or the people there or the people who are being targeted or whose lives are being dismissed. But I sort of thought it was really hollow, and so I got really frustrated with that.
I think for me too, the term like graveyard of empires, because I saw Yusuf, like the tweet that you put out, and I saw across social media this kind of like proud, like Yusuf says, like being really like proud of and trying to say that, oh, we're the graveyard of empires, look at all these past nations and imperialistic countries or forces that came into Afghanistan. They tried to take over our land and all this, but they couldn't. And to me, it's kind of like, well, look at all the violence that the country has gone through in the past, I don't know, century. Like all these invasions and all these like nonstop occupying forces that come in, try to take the natural resources of Afghanistan, try to take the land that they find valuable. So I think part of the response to me when people were responding with, well, we're the graveyard of empires, I understood how it was meant to be framed, but I think I just find the term a little bit, disturbing, because I feel like there's so much more that we can talk about with Afghanistan and not something that's just tied to violence. We've already seen so much tied to violence in the last 2 decades.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you, Halima. I think the frustrating thing that it sounds like we're all kind of feeling in reaction to that is this thing that Afghanistan's legacy is now being changed to something that we may not I don't know. I don't think anyone wants us to think about Afghanistan as just this place that's known as the graveyard of empires, because we all know that there's so much more to the legacy of Afghanistan, to the Afghan people, to what defines us. And unfortunately, it's almost like we're buying into the narrative that's being portrayed about Afghanistan is only relevant in relation to tragedy and violence. And so when we talk about our reactions to it and we fall back into talking about it in that scope of tragedy and violence again as the only hallmark of Afghanistan, then it's like we've lost all beauty of what this nation of peoples are. There's so many characteristics, there's so much rich history, there's so much that we offer, even just the generosity of Afghana we take for granted, maybe because we grew up with other Afghans or our family members who shower us and this and that way. But I mean, it's really a very unique hallmark, and those are not things that you heard people kind of responding back with. They didn't respond back with the character of Afghana as you interact and meet with them on a daily basis. Instead, it was falling into those tropes again of Afghanistan being relevant in relation to tragedy and violence.
Yeah, and it also kind of made me a little, I guess, discouraged, because I think, we're taking our eye off the ball, right? I mean, the conquest that Halima's talking about, exactly about minerals and extractive industry and people raping and pillaging, for lack of, a better term. I mean, that is happening economically right now, arguably, right? And so I think when people have this conception of like, well, the framework is either war or not war, right? We're being invaded or we're not being invaded. Well, can we talk about China? Can we talk about what's happening with the minerals and the resources there and the agreements being signed and infrastructure and all the foreign influence from Pakistan and India, right? In ways in which like people can't conceive that that are just as potentially destructive and invasive as a foreign army, right? And I think that's what really discouraged me, is I saw a lot of really high-minded, sophisticated people falling back on this trope that Iman's talking about, and not sort of saying, okay, well, let me take a moment to think about like, what does empire look like today, right?
Yeah.
And so, is it a graveyard of empires, or has empire just made Afghanistan a graveyard, right, for Afghans? And so, what can we do to sort of push back against that?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I kind of feel like I get it though. Like when you're like, it's sort of one of those. There's not always a lot to, or when you grow up in the U.S. and you constantly are bombarded with all this negative imagery, you kind of hold on to things, right? And so like this whole like graveyard of empire things is like this easy thing to latch onto. So for me, like I always was like, oh yeah, like well, graveyard of empires, like nobody can mess with Afghans, this and that. But then like it took some people to really open my eyes and like explain like how that can be an issue and kind of problematic. But it was, I mean, it's hard because when you don't feel like you have a lot to hold on to, you'll take anything you can get, and you think that that's kind of, this really great claim to fame sort of thing. So,
well, Ahmad, I wish we were able to hold on to more, right? I mean, because there is a lot going on today that I think is reason for hope and reason for pride, right? Not the least of which is like this entire generation of like entrepreneurial, innovative, educated, driven people who are trying to like steer the country in the right direction, like whether through journalism or government or private sector work or whatever, right? So I guess and maybe this is the question that we don't have an answer to, is like, what should we be holding on to now, right? And I think there is stuff to hold on to and to embrace and to kind of bolster. And I think that's where maybe our community can pull together and identify those things, even if they're just themes, and then get behind those.
Well, also because this whole term, the graveyard of empires, didn't come from Afghanistan. Western imperial. It's a British term, no?
Right.
It's an imperialistic term by nature that was given to us. Yes, it's like we kicked you all out, but it's still us taking something that was created by someone else, and sort of made to make us look a certain kind of way, right? And so I think that so much reliance on that phrase is problematic, and it's also not a phrase. I mean, I don't even know how you would say it in Dari, like imperatori, something like that. Like, it doesn't come up. Well, people do say like, yes, masan Inglisar kashidem, Rusar kashidem, whatever. But this whole idea of the actual term graveyard of empires doesn't actually come into existence very much here. The idea does, but not so much the term, because again, I think it's a Western created term.
I think I'm definitely hearing something that just made me think of the really famous line from The Kite Runner that everyone always quotes, for you 1,000 times over. That's the line that they always quote from the book. And that really is just in Dari, Hazar Dafa. You always hear your mom say to you, okay, Bachem Hazar Dafa, which literally translates, for those who don't speak Dari, for Bachem is my child, Hazar Dafa means 1,000 times. Like, that's kind of the spirit of Afghans in a way, are those sorts of the Zarbo Masal that we have. Zarbo Masal means like analogies, metaphors, the way that we speak poetically. But kind of to what you guys are saying, that there's a disconnect for us as Afghan Americans. And I can't blame everyone here either, because, I mean, I grew up in Ohio. I mean, a lot of us grew up, even if we grew up in Afghan communities, we're kind of drawing into thin air. I mean, I'm fortunate for the opportunity to be in a privileged position to have gone through an academic route of reaching out to learn about Afghanistan, but not everyone has access to that per se, right? But I think I really like what you're proposing, Yusuf, that we do have to find a more positive way of creating the image of our community and kind of attaching to it. And I think we do have those things through, I mean, how popular is the Kite Runner, right? And something as simple as Azar Dafa is really a defining feature of our country, but we still fall back to the graveyard of empires, I think, because it does become a popularized trope. And I think we just have to push each other to do two things. One, find those positive attributes of Afghanistan and Afghanistan and our history and our culture that we can encourage each other to learn more about or teach each other about or attach to more or highlight more, and two, to have the courage as the diaspora to allow ourselves to lay claim to those things. Because I think a lot of times as a diaspora community, you kind of feel like, well, who am I to say that this is what Afghanness is? This is just what I call it. I don't know if it really is. Am I being a fraud? Am I authentic? How do I really know? You know what I mean? I think that there is a lot of this kind of like, I'm not sure if I can truly lay claim to it or not, you know?
I feel like one of the things, or there's a handful of things that I feel like, as not only the children of Afghan immigrants that came to America, but also as Afghan-Americans, there's always constant themes that bring us together, right? Food, music, all these other things that Afghanistan just has such a rich history of. For example, there's this entire project, I think, that's being funded out of Canada, and they're trying to restore old film from the film industry in Afghanistan before the Taliban destroyed a lot of it. And there's this amazing story of this, one or two men that essentially risked it all, got as much film reel as they could, and they like buried it under the ground, so that they could save it, so that the Taliban would not burn it. And so now the project is to restore all this old film. And so we have this is something that we could get behind and support. There's an Ahmad Zayer documentary, I think, fundraiser that I saw recently. So I feel like in us trying to grab onto something and holding onto something, I think the easiest thing is Graveyard of Empires. But if we dig a little deeper and the things that we love so much about our culture, there's something out there for us to support or just be in the know of and just enjoy as well. These are the things that we grew up with our parents or grandparents listening to or talking about. I think there's an opportunity there for us as a diaspora to support.
And Halima, I think that's exactly right. And I would just add to that, sort of the reinvigoration and like highlighting of the history is the forward-looking piece, right? Because, I mean, for example, I'm not an expert in this by any means, but I have some familiarity with like the technology sector, and maybe Ali has much more in Afghanistan, and like what percentage of the revenue, of the government's tax collection comes from that industry. And a couple of years ago, that was like 10%. I mean, hundreds of thousands of jobs being created in IT, for example. And I'm not saying that we have to be India or the Philippines or something else, but I think there are these things happening in the country, right, that probably we don't get to hear about, that are a tremendous source of pride and probably building blocks for all of us. So in addition to what Halima is saying in terms of highlighting what we've already done, I think if there's a way to kind of figure out what's being done right now that would be seen as exciting and interesting and new and separate from this narrative of war, we'd have like a pretty good base, right, of what to build on.
Can I add one last thing before we kind of transition to another topic? I think it'd be cool. I don't know if you guys saw the Twitter thing that had gone viral when the Palestinians were like explaining what is a CT, what's your grandma or whatever. If we just did something simple like a viral campaign of hashtag Afghan attributes, or I don't know, somebody else come up with a cooler hashtag, that would literally be like everyone just share an anecdote of something that's sweet from Afghanistan that you know about, your Afghan family, your Afghan something, something like that. I'm like, why don't we just get it trending,
Mm-hmm.
Your Afghan BB.
I mean, yeah,
so we've been talking a lot about just kind of how do we counter that narrative of war and some of the violence that's happening in Afghanistan, and I think these are really awesome ideas. And I think one of the things that's coming up a lot is the peace talks I'm reading about. So it feels like there's this like we're like in a constant state of war, and it's like for most of my life I've never known anything outside of that. I've never known Afghanistan to be anything outside of that. So there's apparently these talks that are happening that are supposed to bring this peace between the Taliban and and Afghanistan and like calm things down. So are people talking about that around you all, and like what are some of your impressions around that, and what you're hearing, especially from those of us that are sort of again from the diaspora, but then Ali, on your end too, like would be interesting to hear sort of what you all are what you're thinking or hearing about that.
I think I'm curious to hear Ali's, if you don't mind telling us what things are like on the ground.
So it's a big question, like what in terms of how people are reacting. It's a big question of what is actually going on with the peace talks, because they're essentially happening behind closed doors in Doha and Qatar, right? And then the Taliban have been invited to Uzbekistan, which is ironic because there isn't religious freedom in Uzbekistan, but okay. And some other places. And this is really, like, if you look at it from sort of like a news angle or a political angle, if you pay attention, they keep talking about two issues. One is withdrawal. Trump announced part of one just, last night. And then the other is this sort of myth of the Taliban providing like a safe haven to foreign terrorist groups and their ability to stage attacks on U.S. interests. And it's constantly, so it's been 9 rounds of talks, and it's constantly this is the 2 points they keep talking about. And neither one of these points have anything to do with the Afghan people. The Afghan government is not part of these talks. So the talks are really by and for the United States and the Taliban. If there's not really a third party, meaning the Afghan people, included or involved in it at all. And it's basically one of those things, we're still waiting. The agreement's supposed to be signed. They've been saying it for a couple of weeks now, any day now. We're still waiting for it to be signed. When it's signed, we'll know what's in it. And then it's also because there's an election coming up, presidential election at the end of September. So now every day people are asking, is the election going to happen? Is the election going to happen? Is the election going to happen? So this is sort of like the situation around it.
Ali, if I could ask a question, how do you and how do the people in Afghanistan, how do you think they grapple with that much uncertainty in terms of, one, the peace talks, quote unquote peace talks, and then the upcoming elections as well?
So this is exactly it's not entirely new, and I'll get to that in a second, but it's this is exactly the problem, because literally every day this is what people are asking, right? If you go to like the store, it comes up. If you go see your family, it comes up. If you talk to other journalists and even to politicians and things like that, it's this really sort of odd state of waiting, and it's quite frustrating, right? So like the 2 most recent examples were in 2013 when Obama announced a foreign troop withdrawal. The U.S. started and everyone else followed, and there was sort of this fear of what would happen. And then at the same time, again, there was a presidential election coming. The presidential election turned into this whole fiasco about corruptions of allegation on all sides and all these people cheating and everything. And the U.S. had to come negotiate what is now the National Unity Government. And those negotiations also took place behind closed doors. No one knew what was being said. No one knew what that agreement said. Like, the president and the chief executive signed the agreement, and people still didn't know what was in it until later that day. So it's not entirely new, but I feel like this is probably like the biggest example of it.
Yeah, I think I grew up right in New York City and during the Soviet after the Soviet War, and I knew Zalmay Khalilzad's name because like how many prominent Afghans are there, right? Like in the 80s, so he was like a mythical figure, like a couple other ones in our community. And throughout the years, I've become a little more cynical about him. But I think it's very problematic because I think folks, one, to Ali's point, probably assume that he has any interest in what happens in Afghanistan for the Afghans, which is not technically or probably otherwise true. Like, that wouldn't be his job. And somehow the fact that he's Afghan makes a difference, which I don't think is true. And then 2, I think it shocks me that we could have this conversation about peace talks and correctly someone could refer to the Afghan government as a third party. Like, how is that possible, right? And that's how this is structured. So I think it's a cynical move by the U.S., and I'm only speaking for myself, no one I work with or work for. I think it's a cynical move by the U.S., and I think at the end of the day, like, what I'm finding interesting is reading accounts from women, for example, right, in Afghanistan about what's going to happen to them if these talks kind of end up with a peace agreement that effectively leads to the U.S. withdrawing, and the Taliban, who hold, I think I'm right in saying this, more land now than they have since 2001 in the country, right? What's going to happen to them? What's going to happen to religious minorities? What's going to happen, to people who don't want to abide by certain codes that the Taliban want? I just, it worries me, and I feel like where I'm seeing value in the coverage is actually from the minority groups in Afghanistan and representatives of those groups in the U.S., because I think those folks are like really tuned into what could happen. Other folks, I think, are just thinking, yeah, peace is good. Yeah, great. Peace is good, right? And I think that is very dangerous.
I think for me, just to quickly add, as a person with multiple identities, right? Afghan/American, as a Muslim, and then as a Shia Muslim specifically, I think for me there's a lot of just skepticism with all of this. We've seen throughout the years the havoc that the Taliban has caused to the larger Afghan community in Afghanistan itself, but then more specifically to the minority groups in Afghanistan. So for me, having the Taliban having this essentially almost like a free reign to decide whatever they want, whatever they think is within their realm of like Islamic principles and all that, to me it's just very worrying, because I think and we've seen before that the cost of that is just escalated attacks on minorities, restrictions on women, and all of that. So for me, I just personally, there's a lot of skepticism, and I don't see this faring well for the most vulnerable groups within Afghanistan.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Halima. And I think I share a lot of you guys' frustrations, exactly what you just said. One, what's going to happen to the minority groups. And I think, maybe this is an aside, but even just when we talk about the Taliban, people talk about it in a way that Taliban is synonymous with Afghanistan, as if they came from Afghanistan, were created by Afghans, and are funded by them, which is, we know is completely not true, right? And so it's almost, the slap in the face is already there by what Yusuf said, that Afghanistan is being treated almost like a third-party side pawn piece in these quote-unquote peace talks, or whatever you want to call them. But the slap in the face is even more when you think about the Taliban aren't Afghan. They're not. They're a force that has been terrorizing us, yes, but it hurts even more when it's like that. The name of this group that have been our terrorists are also becoming synonymous with our identity now. You know what I mean? I don't know if I'm taking that too far, but
I also, just to add to that, I hate, and this is the last thing, I hate that it gives so much legitimacy to a group that has caused so much terror to our country. So I 100% agree.
Well, a lot of people have legitimacy in this country that don't deserve it, right? There are a lot of warlords left over from the Civil War who are sitting very comfortable, being given government positions left and right. So unfortunately, this is nothing new.
And Ali, that this kind of ties into a question from Facebook that we had. Somebody asked, like, who does the Taliban represent? Like, whose interests do they represent in Afghanistan? Like, I guess they're trying to understand the current nature of the Taliban. So this was a question from Facebook. So I don't know if you had a response to that.
It's complicated, right? Because yes, the Taliban is funded by Pakistan, it's funded by Iran, it's funded by other governments, it's funded by Russia. That's undeniable, and that's very obvious. This is why politicians keep saying it's an imposed war. Like, we unfortunately have two of the worst neighbors in the world who are constantly interfering. But there is, Hamid Karzai coined this phrase that I think actually does make a lot of sense. Brotherان naraz, like disgruntled brothers. There are definitely some people who joined, the Taliban movement because of injustices they saw, because of difficulties that they're facing, because of the fact that issues affecting their lives were never addressed. And how much they're actually tied to the central Taliban, that's another issue entirely. But, you know, there are people, because the government has failed in so many things, that do turn to the Taliban for, you know, things as simple as justice. You know, like if you have a land issue, it's much easier to go to the Taliban to get it resolved than it is to go the official government route, which could take years and hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in bribes. And there are people who feel like, you know, like if you're constantly being droned, if you have night raids in your houses, if your women and children are being killed, and you have this group that's saying we're anti this and we can protect you from that, you know, that's a legitimate concern. And so this is it's a complicated issue because there's no entirely good side in it, to be quite honest.
And go ahead, Yusuf.
No, go ahead, Omar.
I was just going to ask sort of what can be, you know, the Taliban and the U.S., right, are the ones that are having this conversation, and especially for those of us in the U.S. as a diaspora, like, what role do we play in these conversations? Like, I know for me, sometimes I'm kind of like, it's hard for me to like think to like have a say or a comment or anything, because I'm like, how. I didn't grow up there. I'm not from there. So like, should I have a say? Should I be involved? How invested should I be? So, I was wondering what you all think is sort of the diaspora's role in these talks and in these conversations that are happening.
I think so. For me, it's like it's something that I grapple with, because on the one hand, I'm so invested in the peace and security of Afghanistan, but at the same time, I'm far removed from it as well. It's a country that I've never stepped foot in, but love so dearly. And so part of, I think, the peace talks and the path to peace for the long term, for me personally, is amplifying voices within Afghanistan. So whether that's minority groups who want specific asks that to come out of the peace talks, whether that's activists on the ground, or any other way where you can just support someone or a group of people within Afghanistan itself. The work that, you know, some of the work that we did with the Afghan diaspora for equality and progress was working in conjunction with Afghan women and amplifying their voice in terms of what they wanted and what they saw as a secure way to at least have women's rights in some fashion protected during these peace talks. And so that's, you know, whatever opinion you may have in terms of like sitting at the negotiating table with Afghanistan, with the Taliban, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, if this specific marginalized group is asking or wants these types of things based on the situation that we're in, you know, it's kind of the thing that you support and push for. So that's one thing. And I think just being in tune with how the U.S. government also responds to these talks and seeing if you can call your representatives, asking them to pay attention or asking them specifically about the talks, I think that can go a long way as well.
Yeah, something Halima said like really resonated with me, because like I disagree with it, because she said, you know, she made a point about who is she, whereas I would say you, more than Marco Rubio or Lindsey Graham or Ben Cardin or, you know, Bob Nanette, you have much more of a right? We have much more of a right, much more place and authority to say something, right, and to engage. So I disagree with you, but I agree with you on that. Like, I think that absolutely, like, the people on this call and who are interested have a right. Two, I think what ADEP did was really valuable, because I think taking an approach to this issue by kind of framing it as multiple fronts in this battle, for lack of a better term, is important. And there is a front that is the U.S. government and policy. And I think there's a level of sophistication that we're starting to see in our community about people engaging, right? And I think that's really valuable, because for me, it's not about whether the U.S. is there or there isn't, but it's like how much room there is there for growth, right? How comfortable do governments feel contributing and donors feel contributing, right? How much faith do they have to at least point about there not being corruption, right? And what can we do to support initiatives that kind of create more green space for like the good work to happen? right? So I think a lot of the lobbying work, contacting representatives, like writing letters to people, I think it makes a difference because like you might catch someone on the right day and you might impact like a really small vote on a minor issue for a bill that has a footnote about Afghanistan in there, but that footnote could be really, really, really significant, right, in terms of what happens on the ground.
And what do you, oh, go ahead.
Oh, are we going to go ahead, Halima? Oh, your mic is off.
You're on mute.
Sorry. The very last thing I was going to say, just to Yusuf John's point, our ADEP does have an action guide. So if you want to reach out to your representative and you're not sure what to say, how to go about it, we do have an action guide on our website, and it gives you a script, what you can say, how to reach out. So definitely check that out.
Yeah, and I think just to echo what you guys are saying is we have to acknowledge that, first of all, if there was an answer, the solution, our problem would be solved and we wouldn't be asking this question, right? But in that vein too, kind of the threads of what both you, Halima, and Yusuf were saying is there's multiple fronts. And I think at the very least, if we have an emotional attachment to something, just like we have an emotional attachment to our families, it's kind of, I would implore us all to take some sort of action, whichever way you feel comfortable. So whether that's engaging with your Afghan-American community, your American community, your Afghan community in Afghanistan, whatever it may be, all three of these communities are symbiotically intertwined, and they're honestly like the different vessels to your heart. They're all a part of us in a way that you can't deny. So if we're not registered to vote, I think we're doing a disservice to Afghanistan. If we're not registered to vote here in the US, if you don't feel comfortable voting for whatever reason, share a tweet from ADEP. I think we can all do things like that. If you want to help your family in Afghanistan, go ahead and do something like that. But whatever it may be, wherever our comfort levels may lie, I think I would say that if we take no action, we are responsible. If we don't take any kind of action to any of these identities that we are privileged to be a part of, I guess apathy is the worst form of, is the worst thing that we could do. So anything that is non-apathetic would be a good approach, or at least a starting place to go.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that, and I would say like one of my hopes for us is that we move beyond outrage, right? Yeah. Because like a lot of people can be outraged, right? But like what we probably can do more than be outraged, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think as a community, that's the big question for me. It's like, how do we move beyond outrage, right? And still keep our jobs and pay our rent and whatever we need to do, right? But how do we move beyond that? And I really appreciate this conversation because like it's getting some gears turning, but I think that's one of the biggest challenges.
Can I add one tiny action item? It'd be really cool, and I don't know if this already exists or not, so I'm just asking the question out there. Is there like a website or anything out there that kind of coalesces together the different Afghan-American groups that are working on different issue matters? Because I think one problem that Afghans have is it's like ADEP is doing really cool stuff on civic engagement and political activism and all that kind of stuff. Some Afghans don't know about it. They go reinvent the wheel and try to do the same thing again. Instead of us supporting one another and building off of each other by engaging with one another. So I wonder if TSN would maybe spearhead that, or if anyone has an answer to that, share it, because I think we should do something, whether it's on the AAC website, TSN, ADEP, whatever, some sort of platform where we can access what's out there just so we know where to get involved in.
Did you just voluntold us, Iman?
I'm putting an action call out there. I'm hoping that people will engage on Facebook and Twitter and all of that, and maybe we can see if anyone wants to.
No.
If anyone has the answer to that, tweet me.
I would just say that, like, as much as we can sort of come together and work together and collaborate and like do this stuff, I think that will, like, that's, as a Warriors fan, strength in numbers is always something dear to me. So that is something we can try our best to do. So I'm glad that Halima from, Afghan Diaspora for Quality Progress, ADEP, is joined this call, was able to kind of chat and tell us a lot about, the work that they're doing, which is really awesome stuff. So, Ali, you're going to say something? Go ahead. Yeah.
I think the answer to your question is in front of you all. Like every time I'm on one of these calls, I'm always so impressed. Like, I didn't know we had, Afghana like this in the United States, like a PhD in sociology, or someone starting like this, like the social activism, or like this political activism group, or like in the media and all of that. So I think there has to be a way to take advantage of that. I mean, you guys have a conference every year where, like, I don't know, 1,000 people or hundreds of people attend, and you all have voices and you all have different ways that, I'm not saying everybody has to go on CNN, but there's always news outlets and things like that looking for, even small ones, local ones, looking for someone to write something, looking for someone to say something, even if they're not looking, be the one to do it, because this is the problem, is I feel like, because think about it, like Trump has said a million ridiculous things about this country, and it's the one issue that he could say anything he wants, and the Western media doesn't care, so everyone wants to be anti-Trump now, so you have this brilliant opportunity, and and you have these brilliant people, so I think each of you in your own way are already doing things and can be doing other sort of simple things to be the voice out there to bring up these issues.
And I think Ali kind of helps us kind of close out this call of talking about sort of what does bring all of us some hope, or some points of joy, or whatever it may be when we look to Afghanistan. We talked earlier about how sometimes we look at it through this lens of this deficit lens, or this lens of just like war and tragedy. So what brings you all hope, whether it's in the diaspora or in Afghanistan, like, in the ways that we can support? So Ali, you kind of shared a little bit, so we'd love to hear from other folks.
I can kick that off. I think in the diaspora, what gives me hope is just the awareness that I see increasing awareness about what's going on in the motherland. And then in the motherland itself, I think what gives me hope is the reporters, the news people that show up to work even though their stations get attacked, the young people who are pushing the country and hopefully steering it into the right direction. So those are the things that give me hope.
Yeah, I think I'll just say, since my contribution here is based off of living with Afghans and watching them all like a creep for 18 months and interviewing them like crazy, I would say, well, so see, that's the question I always get is, what did you find? What did you see? And I say that's what gives me hope, because the hallmark of what I saw is going back to the cheesy line I quoted earlier, Azar Dafa, the thing you hear every BB, every grandmother say a million times over, 1,000 times over, is the hallmark of Afghans, our love, passion, and generosity. And just seeing that thread and how persistent it is in, I would argue to say, every single Afghan, whether I agree with their political viewpoints or their life perspectives or not, has had within them, is that love, passion, and generosity. And I hope that, if anything, we can continue that within our diaspora, within the Afghans that are born in Afghanistan. Just kind of, I guess that spirit, that's what continues to give me hope, because I see that alive in every TSN conversation and in every Afghan I've met, even the random ones you hear speaking Dari in the grocery store and you go up to say hi just to feel like you're at home with. So.
Yeah, and just briefly, I'll say I agree with all of that from Ali, Halima, and Iman. And I think just adding to that, like three things. One, I think in the diaspora, people are not afraid to be seen. And I grew up most of my life wanting not to be from Afghanistan, and like my name being different, all that stuff. And I'm sensing a change, and people are leveraging their positions, whether it's in academics or in art or in media or in policy. People are not hiding who they are and where they're from and why it matters. And the third thing I think is that I think there's like both in Afghanistan, from what I understand, and here there is a refusal to accept the status quo among a significant amount of young people, and I think that's really, really valuable because I think like that relentlessness, even if we screw it up, even if we do it kind of sloppy and we get it wrong, and we're not polished, I think a refusal to accept the status quo is something that I'm at least sensing, and that gives me a lot of hope because I think that's like the first required step for us to do better.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. I mean, for me, this call and seeing you all here again, sort of like what Ali was saying, is just what brings me hope and what I'm always excited to see and hear from all of you. So thank you all for joining today. And I know we took a lot of time. Ali, you woke up really early, so thank you for doing that. So keep having these conversations. Please follow us on Instagram, follow us on Facebook, listen to our podcast on iTunes or wherever it may be. So please shoot us that like button, listen to our work, and please leave comments, questions, anything you might have. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a good night. Peace.
Thanks.
Bye.